As a pastor, I do a lot of marital counseling. And it occurred to me that in analyzing this conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, a model of counseling might be enlightening here, in the sense that, you know, sometimes I have a husband and a wife sitting in front of me in my office, and they're speaking about their conflicts and how angry they are at each other. And I have found many times that when I interview just one of the two parties, for example, the wife may come in and present a very dismal picture of how oppressive her husband is and so on and so forth. And I say, man, this guy's a monster. He needs to be somehow put under control. And then I meet with him because I feel, well, I need to speak to him and put him in his place. And then all of a sudden I give him opportunity to express himself, and it reveals another side of the story. And then I go, whenever I speak to one or the other, you see that they're both convinced of the righteousness of their position. But when you hear both of them, it becomes very complex. So that as long as you just keep shifting from one to the other, you really cannot understand the whole complexity. So you have to sit down and kind of take the thread and go back to the origins. Right. And then when you find the origins, a lot of things become possible. And also there comes a point when they both have to say, you know what, as long as we just keep trading insults and accusations, there's not going to be any resolution. There has to be some giving up of rights and some negotiating and so on and so forth. Because as long as you present just isolated viewpoints, they each seem to have their merit. And so I think a lot of times when we examine the issues in the Middle East of Israel and you know, the Palestinians and the claims of Islam as a whole, you have to take a look at all of the different issues. Unless you do that, you're apt to go to one side and to the other. And I think that's what's happening with many anti-Israel perspectives here, is that, you know, they're neglecting to look at other issues, the issue of Islamic fundamentalism, hatred toward Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, the fact that Israel is a very, very small country, that the Israelis really have nowhere to go, and that they are also surrounded by these hostile countries, and right within their land, they have a very hostile element as well, not just the Palestinians, but also terrorist organizations that control the goings-on of the Palestinian people. And so as long as you neglect to see that complexity in its wholeness, you're going to be just amputating the complexity of these issues. And that's, you know, that's one of the problems.
And when I was at the checkpoint, at one point, one of you know, a pro-Israel activist, I mean, excuse me, a pro-Palestinian activist, he came up and he pointed to the men. He says, is this tolerable? Is this something that you can accept? Is this acceptable? And my response was, look, the Second Intifada killed an awful lot of Israelis. A lot of Israelis died as a result of suicide bombings. And he said, well, the Second Intifada, that was, you know, several years ago. That's kind of over. And I made that statement. I relayed that statement to an Israeli Jew a few days later, and he said, oh, you know, there are an awful lot of Israelis who lost, you know, limbs and loved ones, for whom the Second Intifada is not over. It's still a problem. And so, and one of the things that he said to me at this point was, and by the way, more Israelis die in automobile accidents than they do from terrorism. And I reacted. I said, when you make an argument like that, I don't ever want to speak to you again. And I think that caught him up. And to his credit, he said, the argument is withdrawn. I retracted. And at that point, I was willing to talk and transact emotionally with this pro-Palestinian activist in a way that I hadn't been before, because he was willing to take a risk. And I think this is one of the things that I think we have to look at. And the thing is that a few days later, I wept. I flew back from Bethlehem to the United States, and I stayed in a hotel in London on a layover, and I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning weeping, and I said, what am I crying over? And it was those men at the checkpoint. And I felt on one hand that I was betraying every Jewish friend that I've ever made since 2005, but then I realized it wasn't just the fact that they were suffering at the checkpoint, but that there was really no leaders, no Palestinian leaders that would actually effectively advocate or lead them properly. because the Palestinian leaders have been catastrophically irresponsible for decades. Between the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem that supported Nazism and helped broadcast it into the Middle East, to Yasser Arafat that basically said no to the Clinton parameters, even when Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia said, this is a good deal, you better take it, in effect, that was what he said. These men, they don't have anybody that's really looking out for their interests. And that must be a hopeless situation for them to be in. And it must be awful to have to deal with the disdain from Israeli soldiers under those conditions.
But let me react to that, because my first reaction, my visceral reaction is, you know, what can be done? Is there hope for this marriage? Because it just seems that it's kind of at a deadlocked.
I think,
you know,
that
when you look at both sides, it's just
Tony Campolo, who was one of the last speakers, he spoke at the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, and he used ultimately the same model that you just used of a therapist. And I don't know whether or not that's realistic, but because ultimately it's between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But one of the things he said to the Palestinian Christians who organized the Christ at the Checkpoint conference is, can you be empathetic to both the Israelis and to your fellow Palestinians? And can you acknowledge the pain and suffering on both sides? And I don't know if they can, structurally, given the environment that they operate in.
But forgive me, Dexter, here's the point, though, that sometimes language can be extremely elusive and treacherous. And when you say Palestinians, you know, the term sounds very simple, but Palestinians also is attached to terrorist organizations. Palestinians is also attached to Islamic nations that want Israel neutralized.
Yeah.
And Palestinian is attached to a particular perception on the part of European activist groups, whether in London or France or Holland and so on and so forth. So, you know, the Palestinian people in themselves are really almost an elusive entity, because they don't exist as such neutrally.
Right.
They exist in the context of all kinds of relationships. Sometimes it's easy almost to see the Palestinians as a pawn in the hands of many other political entities that want to manipulate them, want to keep them alive as an issue in order to attack other issues, whether it's America, whether it's Israel, and so on. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, you see, and this gets at the notion of, Newt Gingrich a while back described the Palestinians as an invented people, and that clearly is offensive to the Palestinians. Whether or not the Palestinians are an invented people is not the issue. The issue is the national purpose and goal that the Palestinians embrace for themselves here on out. And there is a large group of people within Palestinian society that think that their goal should be to continually to antagonize, attack, and disrupt Jewish national life. And ultimately, what they're trying to do is to exercise a veto on Jewish national life on a daily basis in the Jewish state. And if that's going to be their goal, and if that's going to be the purpose or the transcendent purpose that they pick, the reality is that they're going to continue to suffer.
And by the way, we've established a few lines of dialogue here since we began. Let's go back to one of them, and then we'll just kind of keep going back and forth. A Gentile or non-Jew working for an essentially Jewish organization. Part of that began through your writing this article, and I'd like to pick up on that a little bit more. How are you able to work in harmony with an essentially Jewish organization, and you not being Jewish? How did that develop, and where do you find that?
Well, I think part of it is that I grew up a Protestant, and I didn't read the Old Testament as much as I should have, but I regarded the Old Testament largely as a map to my own psyche and my own soul, okay? And I can, if we had more time, I could talk to you about how, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Esau, how all of that played out in my personal family and in my life. My father, he was set to invade Japan when they dropped the bomb. He was in the Philippines. He lost a brother in Iwo Jima. His older brother was supposed to inherit all of the family's wealth. He was supposed to essentially get the blessing. And he died in Iwo Jima, and the blessing was transferred to my dad, who was the younger son. Okay? And so, you know, at a certain point when you read Genesis,
Right.
you
So
go,
you were living the Jewish drama, the Old Testament drama. In your
and
own
this is one of the things is that, you know, so I understood, and I didn't even know it at the time, but I understood, you know, that Exodus and Genesis, that they actually were a map to my life in ways that that I didn't even understand.